Welcome back to the podcast. Today I'm going to dive into something that's an issue for almost every CISO, and that's talking to executives. In your organization, that might not be a board, it might be CEO, CIO, COO, take your pick, whatever your leadership is called in your organization. Every CISO has had to face this when leadership asks, what's the biggest risk right now? And generally, you're going to give them a list of threats because that's what we normally do, right? But think about how other executives, when they enter that conversation, the CFOs presenting, they don't talk about the threat of inflation as an abstract concept. They talk about margin compression and quarterly forecasts. When sales is presenting, they don't talk about the threat of competitors. They talk about market share in the sales pipeline. Do you see the difference? But in cyber, we have a habit of leading with the scary stuff. We talk about the who and the how and the hackers and the malware instead of the what and the how much. So what your leadership is actually asking for are generally three specific questions, whether they use these exact words or not. The first one is, what's the biggest risk right now? And the second one is, how much is it going to cost if this happens? How bad is it going to be? And number three, tell them about spending. Are we spending our limited capital in the right places? So today, I'm going to give you an easy way to answer all three of these with evidence. Not a gut feeling, not an opinion, and not a color-coded heat map, but numbers. Numbers that are time-bound, repeatable, and most importantly, decision grade. Now let's talk about why your leadership keeps cornering you and why the solution is really all about the numbers. I'm going to call this next section the board mandate, governance over geography. You'll get the reference in just a minute. So we're going to start by reframing what your leadership actually needs. As a CISO, you're the expert on the geography of the network. You know where the holes are and who's trying to climb through them. But leadership's mandate is not technical, it's fiduciary. They don't govern threats, they govern risk trade-offs. They're looking at a finite pool of money, trying to decide if it should go to a new marketing campaign or an acquisition or your cyber budget. And if you describe a threat in technical terms, you're asking them to become an amateur security analyst just to understand you. That's not going to happen. So what they actually want is this. They want a near-term view, meaning what matters in the next quarter, because that's how they generally look at things. Short-term, 30, 60, 90 days, quarter by quarter. Secondly, they want to understand the magnitude, meaning how bad could that bad day be in dollars? What's the cost? And then the third thing is really a decision, meaning what are we going to do today? Every time you go in front of leadership, generally, they're going to be trying to make a decision. So threat lists don't create decisions, numbers do. And when you provide a list of the top 10 threats, you're giving them homework to do. You're forcing them to try and translate your technical jargon into business impact. How many times have you already done that and proven to yourself that it doesn't work? That's your job, and they're not going to do it for you. But if you provide a quantified forecast, then you've done the work for them. You've moved from being a reporter of bad news to a partner in business resilience, and that's what we're going to talk about. Here's where I introduce you to the cyber risk forecast. It's a monthly forecast of your industry's risk. It also gives you business profiles, one of which will match your exact company's security profile. That means that your business risk has already been analyzed, summarized, and quantified for you. So stay with me and let me walk you through those numbers that leadership wants. I'm going to call this next section the numbers, decision grade deliverable. So let's define what a number actually looks like in plain English. When I ask, or when I say you need to give them a number, we're not talking about a magic ball predicting the exact day of a breach. That's impossible. What executives want is decision grade data. In other words, enough to make the decision. The quantified forecast delivers this with three distinct non-negotiable parts. The first is what we call likelihood. This is the probability of a specific scenario occurring in a specific time frame, and that would be 30, 60, 90 days. And we give it a range of probability, 60 to 80% likelihood or probability that you're going to see this specific scenario happen in our industry. And when you use the business profiles, that really dials it in to your specific business. The second thing that the forecast gives you is direction. That's the momentum. Is this risk trending up or down? How have we seen it behave in the last 30, 60, 90 days? That gives you an idea of what to expect for the next 30, 60 to 90 days. And this is finely grained because we're driving this on a monthly update. So you can see how it changes monthly. You don't have to wait a year to get the report, 6 months, or even a quarter. You're going to see it over a monthly time period. And the third thing that they want, remember, is that financial exposure. That's the so what factor. And you can give them low and high end ranges. And these numbers include response costs, legal fees, lost revenue, because they're taken from what your peers have been paying for exactly the same kind of incidents in the last 30, 60, 90 days. So these numbers are quite accurate. Now, every CISO that I know struggles with this in large part because it's hard to estimate. And if you go to your finance people and say, help me build this estimate, they're going to push back because they don't want to be wrong. That's a good way to get fired in their industry. So every CISO generally just drops that part out of the conversation with leadership, and then they wonder why decisions don't get made. That's because that information isn't there. You need all three for leadership to have the information to be able to make the decisions. And that financial part is extremely important. Now, we've talked about the three questions they're asking and some of how the report gives you those exact three values. So let's talk a little bit more in some comparisons. So if you are, let's go back to the meeting, you're talking to leadership. If the CFO comes in and says the tax bill next year will be between 20 and 22 million or whatever, no one is going to say that they failed because they don't have the exact amount. Ranges are used all the time is my point. And so leadership is used to this. In cyber, you may have had the idea you must be precise. That's not true. You have to be accurate. And that's what the forecast gives you. Accurate numbers and estimates for the 30, 60, and 90-day upcoming horizon. So that timeline is another thing that many CISOs get tripped up on when they talk about trying to quantify risk, because you don't have the data to make that kind of authoritative statement about 30, 60, 90 days. You would have had to have done the research that we already do for you to know what the past cycle looked like and what the past cycles before that looked like, and have trended them the way that we already have in order to be able to say that's what's going to happen in the next 30, 60, 90 days. So unless you've already done this level of research, you can't possibly make those statements. That's why the forecast is so important for CISOs, because it's already done the analysis for you. So when you have this, one of the key things you're going to be able to do with leadership is talk about prioritizing. And that's something leadership is always looking for. How do I tell what is more important than something else? And you'll be able to say scenario A is a higher likelihood of impact than scenario B over the next 90 days, although scenario B in the long term is still a high risk. You'll be able to make these kinds of statements and have the information, the analysis to back that up, because that's what the forecast is. That's what the forecast gives you. So here's another important thing, reducing surprise. So when you have a forecast and you have this conversation with leadership and you've told them what the likelihood for certain kinds of events are in the future, even if they stay consistent in that future for the next 6 months, when an incident occurs, what leadership is going to think isn't, oh, this is a surprise. Instead, they're going to say, oh, yeah, you told me this was likely. This is what it looks like when it occurs. And because the forecast also gives you mitigation recommendations and even what to look for in indicators in your own network, then you already know and can have that conversation with the board about the fact that you've also been able to measurably reduce that risk, measurably reduce that likelihood. And again, unless you're doing this kind of analysis, that's not something that you can easily say, right? Right, exactly. So that's the whole point of the forecast and looking at it 30, 60, and 90 days, and how, a little bit into the mechanism of how we are able to give that information with such high confidence on the accuracy. And again, what we're talking about is not being precise. That's nearly impossible, but you can be accurate. That's absolutely possible to do. So one of the things we talk about in these ranges is that we prefer to do it on a 5-point scale from very low to very high. So it's very low, low, moderate, high, very high. And that's the way you should also phrase this, not a 3, high, medium, and low, but a 5-point scale. And everything that we do is built around that. And so we anchor these ranges by observable signals. So we look at a number of things. We look at threat activity, we look at kinds of attacks, we look at whether or not reports are verifiable reports or whether they're a one-off. We only use authoritative sources. We go through a very rigorous check before we include these signals into the analysis process. So this lets you know that we're not looking at extreme outliers that could be shaping this. Instead, we're looking at what is truly an industry benchmark. And that's one of the other things that we do is for every industry, we benchmark not only the threats and behaviors, but the control effectiveness against those attacks. And we keep track of the top 5 attacks in each industry and how they're fluctuating, and whether or not any new or emerging threats should be listed in that top 5 that are the most impactful to organizations. So now let's talk about what this conversation looks like again with your executive. So imagine you're in an elevator going up to the 5th floor. Leadership walks in and says, "What's the biggest risk right now?" Your response is something like, "Over the next 90 days, our biggest exposure is scenario A," whatever, and it's stable or it's trending up. That's very powerful and concise. If leadership says, "Well, what would this cost?" Right? What would this cost? Then you could say, "Oh, this specific scenario based on industry statistics is a range of this to this, and primarily that's driven by whatever the drivers are." And all of that is, again, given in the forecast. Each risk is quantified, and then the financial impacts are provided. So then they're going to say, "Well, how are we spending?" Now, this is where the business profiles come into play, because the profiles are selected based on where you are in alignment with everyone else in the industry. So you will know when you look at the profile, when you make that selection, oh, we need to spend in this area to reduce this risk, and then that would put us in a different profile, right? And so I wouldn't call it maturity, but it does allow you to understand the factors that are driving your specific business risk in the scenario and what you can do to move yourself to a different threat scenario, right? And so that gives you the information to have that conversation with leadership about whether or not you're spending enough in which areas, or what areas you could spend more on that would measurably change that risk profile for you. And that's powerful stuff. You can't answer these questions if you don't have the analysis to back it up on. And that's why the risk forecast is so powerful. So here's another scenario, and this happens a lot. Leadership sees something in the news, and they come to you and say, "Hey, we just saw company X over here, and they got hit by whatever the scenario was, ransomware or whatever. What's the chance this could happen to us?" Because you have been reading the report and you have the forecast, you'll know month to month how those risks are changing. And because you're using the profile, you'll know exactly the likelihood of that happening to your business because of your security profile and the external impacts that are driving that risk. So you'll be able to easily answer that question. And that, again, is extremely powerful. And being able to answer those kinds of questions along with knowing the financial cost to reduce that, that's how you get budgets approved, okay? So, and these kinds of conversations happen all the time at the leadership level, and that's the level that they're hearing and seeing the technical things that you are deep in the weeds on. And this is how you bridge the gap in the conversation between being very technical to having the right answers at the right time to the questions that leadership is asking about what they see happening in the environment and what you actually need to affect change for the company and to build in that resilience. And being able to have those conversations in this way is a real game changer with leadership because that's the level that they're thinking about. So now, let me wrap this up a little bit. And here's kind of what I'll give you as the bottom line. The board doesn't want certainty. They want a defensible range that they can act on. Threats create anxiety for them, but forecasted numbers create comfort with that uncertainty and the ability to make decisions. So your call to action this week is simple. Don't wait for the next board meeting to start this. You can build a one-page board number briefing on your own right now. And when you subscribe to the risk forecast, you'll have right away all the information you need to help drive this because you'll know what are the top risks and you'll know which of these are more likely in your industry and you'll understand the drivers of that risk and you'll understand what you would actually need to do to move those numbers in your favor and to help you move from one risk profile for your business to a different risk profile for your business. Okay, I'm going to stop it here and just suggest keep an eye out in the next couple of weeks because I'm going to be doing some different things. One thing I'm going to be doing is partnering with another company that does some tabletop exercises, which is very exciting. We're going to be doing a lot of talk about that because that's a good way to improve risk reduction for these kinds of scenarios. And then also in May, look for the new version of these business level sub-industry, the business level forecasts to come out. Find the one that matches your business, and then you can start looking at these risk profiles. And I will see you in the next episode.